Good morning to everybody and a very warm welcome indeed to Belief, Bodies, Tombs and Tourists. My name is Susan Buckham and I'm the Edinburgh World Heritage Graveyards Project Manager, and I'm responsible for the Making Lasting Impressions Greyfriars Kirkyard Community Learning and Engagement Project. Now do please tell us where you are joining us from today in the chat function found in your meeting controls, and about any interests or connections that you have to Greyfriars. We'd love to know more about our guests. So today is all about celebrating what is known about this iconic and unique graveyard, but it's also thinking about what kind of questions we might still ask about this remarkable place that can help deepen our understanding of Greyfriars Kirkyard and our appreciation of its significance. Now, over 300 people have registered for today's conference. Thank you. This, to me, powerfully testifies to Greyfriars' importance to people today. So I would like to begin today's event by asking you a question. Which word would you use to describe what Greyfriars means to you? It's tricky, I know. You can use two words if these can be hyphenated. In my case, it would be mural monuments. Now, please post your word in the chat function over the day, so that eventually, once we finish this event, we can build a word cloud of these associations and tease out what it is that people like, think or feel about Greyfriars Kirkyard. Now, the aim of the Making Lasting Impressions project is to involve a wider range of people with the Kirkyard, and I very much want you to be involved in today's conference. Please ask questions using the questions and answers function. And we'll pose these to the speakers at the end of the 4 thematic sessions. Now, please post your comments and thoughts throughout the day using the chat function, which is also there to let us know of any problems. But of course, we won't have any problems today. I'd like to thank you for keeping the comments and questions respectful and focused on the topic at hand. Both the chat and the questions and A function can be found in your meeting controls. Now, today we're using Zoom's webinar platform, so you won't be able to use your camera or microphone, which means that you can focus your screens on our speakers and their talks. And eventually this recording will be made available on the Edinburgh World Heritage YouTube channel. We'll provide a link to the chat in a moment of the full programme so that you can look at this throughout the day, but I'll just quickly run through the programme just now. So as you can see on the slide, we have 4 sessions and there'll be a break between each of those sessions. And the first session that we're going to start with is church history, and then we're going to move on to tourism, then the burial landscape, and then tombs. And we're looking to finish the day at around 4:15 this afternoon. Now, this event is brought to you by Edinburgh World Heritage in partnership with the Friends of Greyfriars Kirkyard. Now, their chairperson, Charlotte Gollidge, will take over as conference chair this afternoon. But I'd also like to acknowledge the support of our Making Lasting Impressions project partners, the City of Edinburgh Council, who are the graveyard's owners, and Greyfriars Kirk, who have recently celebrated their 400-year centenary. And of course, our funder, the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Now, it's customary to thank speakers at the end of an event, and I will do this, but I want to acknowledge their positive support from the off. I cannot believe what a fantastic programme we have here today that draws together so many different interest areas. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Mark Jardine, historian, blogger and television researcher, whose PhD examined the militant Covenanters of the Killing Times. And he's going to give us his talk, which is entitled The Defeated, the Covenanters' Prison and the Banished. Over to you, Mark.
Hello everyone, I am Mark Jardine, apparently an expert on the Covenanters, and this is my paper. So the first slide that you can see is the gates of the Covenanters' prison at Greyfriars, which is a sort of long southern extension of the kirkyard created in 1705. So a plaque by the side that you can see just on the left there tells us that this is where over 1,100 Covenanters were imprisoned in the open air in 1679. And when folk look through those gates, they probably imagine the prisoners held there suffering in all kinds of Scottish weather and for months. And that may not be exactly the case, but let's start looking at the prison itself as it existed. So if I could have slide 2, please, Rebecca. Thank you. So what is called the Covenanters' prison today only covers a small proportion of where the prisoners were actually held in 1679. The prison was actually part of a larger enclosure called the Inner Yard, which ran east from the present-day prison to Bristol Place, which is a couple of streets away. So what is the Covenanters' prison is basically that large square in the middle you can see directly below the church. So at the top you can see St Giles, on the left you can see Heriot's School, and the Inner Yard was basically that large square in the middle. It was a grass park of over 3 acres, surrounded on all sides by high walls and accessed via a single gate at the Society Port. And you can just see the Society Port at the top right-hand corner of the rectangle of the yard. So that's the gate into what was become known as the Covenanters' prison, and that's the Society Port just off to the right of that gate. So if I have the third slide, please, Becky. There was no access to the yard via the present-day gate. Instead, a continuous dike ran across the northern side of the yard, and you can just see that dike on the far right-hand side of this slide, and that was built by Heriot's School, the building on the left, in 1662. Right, you can take that slide off now, Becky, please. So here we go. So who were the Covenanters, and why were they imprisoned there? And now that is a very long story indeed. And so I'm going to try my best to avoid sort of 17th century terminology and jargon that, you know, litters the subject, frankly. So let's cut through that as quickly as we can. Okay, so the Covenanters are named after the Covenant, or the National Covenant of 1638, a radical document which was first signed in Greyfriars Kirkyard by nobles, ministers, and remarkably by thousands of ordinary folk across Scotland. It effectively declared that the Scots would limit the power of the king in favour of their parliament and have a Presbyterian church, i.e. one without bishops. It was not universally popular or frankly understood by many who put their names to below its 5,000 words. But it had strong support, particularly from Edinburgh and Fife and down into the southwest, and those really were the sort of covenanting heartlands. It also, the Covenant, kick-started the British Civil Wars. And how do you summarise that? It was 22 years of atrocities, death, famine, plague, all sides fighting each other, regime changes, killing, dictatorship, and the military conquest of Scotland, which all ended when King Charles II was restored. At that point, a grateful Scottish elite, who were determined to make sure things never got out of hand like that again, literally did a sort of Control-Alt-Delete, wiped the Covenanters' records from the statute book and from the General Assembly, ended putting control of the church, and turned any remaining committed Covenanters out of public life. For good measure, a few leading lights of the movement were executed. So the Covenanters were in the political wilderness, out of power. But by 1679, when we get to the Covenanters' prison, they were back. Thousands were in arms at the Battle of Bordeaux in a rising against the regime. There had been a Cold War for decades between the Covenanters and the regime, and it had suddenly turned hot. So this is an image, the slide of the Battle of Bordeaux Bridge, which you can see here. Now, on the left-hand side is the government force, under the Duke of Monmouth, and on the right-hand side are the Covenanters who are defending the bridge. Brothel Bridge was the only way really realistically across the Clyde, and if the Covenanters could hold the bridge, the Duke of Monmouth's army would not cross, and it would effectively be a stalemate. So what do we need to know about the battle itself? Well, it was fought on 22nd June 1679, but what we really need to know is not so much the result. The Covenanters were decisively lost, but the political debates that went on before the battle. And that's important because the impact on what happened in the yard when the prisoners reached there. The rising started when a handful of militant Covenanters assassinated Archbishop Sharp on 3rd May. Events soon spiralled when the militants defeated a government force in Lanarkshire and seized Glasgow. Now thousands joined their camps, including more moderate Covenanters who had initially declined to join their enterprise. I think the moderate Covenanters actually thought that this was a bit mad by these militants to actually start rising on purpose, but that's what they did. So 2 weeks of intense debates and wranglings followed between the two sides over what the covenants obliged them to do and how to avoid God's wrath. The militant leaders, General Robert Hamilton and the field preacher Donald Cargill, argued that their success depended on their demands that the covenants be restored in full and refusing to recognise the authority of the tyrant Charles, as they called him, Charles II. That way, God would be on their side. The moderate Covenanters under John Welsh, who were caught, if you wish, between the militants within the camp and the moderate Presbyterian gentry who were outside the camp, i.e. who were not on their side yet, argued that they should have less strident demands to ensure wider support, as they knew that the Presbyterian gentry would be terrified by such inflexible demands that threatened to impose the covenants on the king and everyone else. Even on the eve of battle, the moderate gentry in the king's army, which was led by the Duke of Monmouth, sent secret agents to Welsh, pleading with him to send a supplication to the Duke in the hope of avoiding a battle which they believed would ruin the Presbyterian cause. Welsh agreed, but Hamilton refused to recognise the king's authority until, perhaps disingenuously, he was told that Cargill had approved the supplication, so Hamilton signed it. At a parley just before the battle, the supplication was presented to Monmouth. His demands were simple: lay down your arms and put your trust in me. So it's sort of like looking for a sort of political way out of this, where there wouldn't actually be a major conflict. But as Hamilton quipped on hearing the terms from Monmouth, i.e., you just have to trust me, aye, and hang next, is what he said. He rejected Monmouth's terms, only to discover that Monmouth had moved his cannon into position. And if you look at the slide, you can see that the cannons are on the far end of the bridge on the left-hand side, and those cannons would be, instrumental in forcing the passage of the bridge. The bridge was soon taken, and Monmouth's army quickly routed the Covenanters on the other side. Over 300 were killed on the field. However, almost the entire leadership, including Cargill, Hamilton and Welsh, escaped and fled into exile. And this brings us to the next slide, which is, Rebecca, which is of the inner yard. So, this is the Covenanters' prison. Now, rebellions tend to be followed by retribution. Someone usually has to pay the price, especially if blood has been spilled. After the battle, the captured Covenanters were marched to Greyfriars and put in the yard. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the regime planned to banish about 300 to 400 of the rebels to the American plantations to set an example. And that was kind of generally what might happen after a major rebellion. But they soon found they had a far greater number of prisoners than that in the yard. We know that many prisoners were in the yard and we know how many prisoners were in the yard and in Heriot School, where the wounded were kept, from the daily ration of penny loaves. So effectively there's a receipt which tells us how many loaves were being bought by the state to feed these people in the yard. On 1st July, the first day that loaves were delivered, and a week after they'd arrived in the yard, 1,184 penny loaves were required. And these loaves are kind of the key to understanding the dynamics of the yard and how the events unfolded within it. The yard was used as a prison as a matter of necessity, not punishment. So people might imagine that they just put them in here in all weathers just to make them suffer. In fact, what was the case was that the justice system in Edinburgh would have been quickly overwhelmed if this numbers problem was not rapidly dealt with. The solution seized on was to quickly release any prisoners who were willing to sign the king's peace, the so-called bond of peace, never to take up arms against the king or his royal authority again, provided they could post a financial bond for their future good behaviour, which clearly some could not because they remained in the yard. Or even though they'd agreed to take the bond, they still didn't manage to fulfil the financial conditions, so they remained in the yard. In this first crisis phase, the majority of prisoners who were encouraged to submit by moderate Presbyterian ministers availed themselves of the bond. Only 10 days later, the numbers of loaves ordered had dramatically dropped to only 338. And the number of loaves continued to decline, and by 6th August, it was down to 250. You can see that almost nearly 1,000 people had managed to take the oath and disappear out the yard rather quickly. And so the numbers in the yard were down to just 250 people in this 3-acre grassy area. After that, a second phase began in which the numbers stabilised, only gradually declining in the yard as the prisoners were removed to Edinburgh's toll booths. By 14th November, the eve of their banishment, 210 were in the yard and apparently 47 in other toll booths. Nothing much had changed in months. What had happened? It appears many of the prisoners had decided to organise themselves to resist it without any militant leadership present. They decided to take a stand against any involvement in the king's authority and force the issue of banishment. In effect, the militant prisoners were dictating their own sentence. They were making a conscious choice to be banished. And I think that's because they probably saw banishment as a sort of form of testimony against the regime that they could make. They were actually making it more difficult for the government by refusing the bonds and therefore would be banished, and that would be a sign of how strong their position was, and it would encourage others. So among them was John Malcolm. So I mean, it's 250 odd prisoners from Galloway, and his words confirmed that he was radicalised at Greyfriars. He had arrived on the eve of the battle, even though his mother was sick, and he went away, but he went anyway, even though he knew, as he said himself, he knew little. The Lord, he says, brought me to Greyfriars Kirkyard, though I came almost naked and wonderfully provided for me and many others. There he rejected the sin of crying up this clarty liberty, as he described the bond of peace, as a price of blood. Death by the Justice General, who swore a great oath at him, that I should die if I would not take the bond. I told him, as it was true, that many better than I had been hanged. So you can see from Malcolm's sort of, writings there that, he was prepared to take a stand and radicalised in the yard itself. So if I have the next slide, please, Rebecca. So this is Magus Muir. So during the prisoners' resistance, the regime adopted a tougher approach. Two field preachers were considered as ringleaders, John Kidd and John King. Frankly, the very few leaders they'd actually managed to capture were executed. And 51 named prisoners were selected for trial, apparently as they obstinately refused to take the bonds and encouraged others not to do so. Among them were 5 men who were executed at the site of the Archbishop's assassination. The Archbishop Sharp had been killed right back at the start of the rising by some militants from Fife, a small handful. But these men were then executed, although they had absolutely nothing to do with the killing itself. They were executed as an example, and this is their grave that you can see on the slide in Magismuir today. 33 more prisoners were ordered banished. But one, Robert Miller in Waterford, managed to escape the ship at the very last moment. So he was a very lucky man indeed that he managed to get out at the very last second. So who were the banished, I guess, is the important question. What did banishment actually mean? It meant, obviously, don't ever come back. That's what banishment means. But it involved being sold into a forced indenture, probably for 10 years. So they weren't actually sort of sold into slavery or anything like that, or sent to a penal colony. That wasn't what was happening. They were actually going to be sent there to work. So the regime had entered into a contract with a Leith merchant and the Laird of Barnton to transport the prisoners. And there was probably a London dimension, as the Crown of London, which is the ship which was to transport them, was to take the prisoners to England's North American colonies. Scots officially weren't allowed to trade with the North American colonies. There, their indentures would be sold and the prisoners taken off to work on farms or plantations until the indenture expired and they were free. And after that, you couldn't come home, but at least you were free. So I'll have the next slide, please. So this is Leith. So in the 17th century, this is how it looked. It's quite nice. So on the 15th of November, the prisoners were marched in chains to Leith and on the Groom, which was lying in the Leith roads. The English captain apparently used them barbarously, stowing them up the decks where they could not get their heads except to sit or lean, and robbing them of many things their friends had sent them for relief. They were allowed little or no water to drink, till many of them fainted and were almost suffocated. And this was actually before they'd even left Leith. So they hadn't even they were on the ship for about a week before it departed, just sitting in Leith, suffering. So it sounds that a voyage was perhaps being undertaken on the cheap, and perhaps the ship was a bit overloaded. They certainly clearly had stuffed as many people into this ship as they could. So if we take, right, so this was only the second time the Scottish regime had attempted a mass banishment of Covenanters to America. The year before, a similar attempt had ended in complete humiliation for the Scottish regime when all the prisoners were legally released when the ship put into Gravesend in England, because English Whigs turned up and said, well, you don't have any legal authority to banish people from England. And they had the prisoners released. So all these prisoners they'd collected from field preachings all came home. So nobody got banished. To evade that fate may have influenced a fateful decision by the Croon's captain or the investors to attempt a northern Atlantic crossing via Orkney in winter. So you can see it's a much trickier voyage to undertake. On 27th November, the Croon sailed, but it was soon met with some very great storms. So if we could have the slide, please, Becky. At 9 to 10 at night on Wednesday, the 10th of December, it was shipwrecked near the Mull of Deerness in Orkney. Attempting to shelter from the storm, it rounded the Mull, cast its anchor, but the wind and seas drove it onto the rocks at Scaravatang. I don't think I've got that right. I'm sorry to any Orcadians who are listening. What happened next made the Croon perhaps the most infamous shipwreck in Scottish history, although now largely forgotten, it has to be said. Its human cargo were abandoned to their fate, locked below deck. Apparently, the captain saw the hazard all were in, and the prisoners might escape, but he would not open the hatches to let the poor prisoners fend for themselves. He, with his seamen, made their escape by a mast laid over between the ship and the rock shore. Some leapt onto the rock. The ship, being strong, endured several strokes where she bilged and began to to sink. Those left behind, crying most pitifully and working as they could to break forth of the prison, but to little purpose, and all these, near 200, with lamentable shrieks of dying men, did perish. The most part cast on the shore dead, and after buried by the country people. So, we have the next slide, please, Becky. Right, so this is an image actually depicting the sinking of the Groom, which is taken from a hind let loose in 1687. So 200 drowned in the disaster of the Crown, and about 57 prisoners reached the shore. The wreck of the Crown was a PR disaster for the regime, as the survivors returned to pointedly tell their tale. So this etching from a hind let loose in 1687 is a classic piece of militant covenant propaganda. So there you can see at the bottom, the drowned in the sea, they're all swimming away, the wreck of the ship. It's all part of actually a bigger sort of set of images. It's one of 6, I think, which show people being hanged. It shows people being shot in the fields. It shows all the sort of sufferings of the Covenanters. And this one is specifically about the Crown. You can tell that that is the one because it's the only wreck of the Covenanters. It's a classic piece of militant propaganda. The drowned had become martyrs for the militant cause. So martyrdom is something that's quite hard to argue with, if you see what I mean. But it erects people into a different level of being almost. With the regime, because these are martyrs for a cause now. But what about our old friend John Malcolm? The Lord, he said, did deliver me from the ragings of the sea. He helped him survive sickness in the aftermath and brought him safely home. But then, as he says, he called me out to hear the gospel, which is quite remarkable actually, because nobody had been field preaching for at least a year. Malcolm joined a new militant movement led by the field preachers Richard Cameron and Donald Cargill, who returned from exile to restart field preaching. On 22nd of June 1680, the anniversary of Bordeaux, Malcolm was probably in the band that proclaimed the Sanker Declaration, which disowned and forfeited the king. It also, in quite an extreme move, declared a war with the king and all his men of his practices as enemies of our Lord Jesus Christ and his cause and covenants, and against all such, anywise acknowledge him in his tyranny. So the declaration, the Sanker Declaration, is quite a remarkable document, and we know that Malcolm probably signed it because he subscribed the bond taken before it. But the declaration loosed the militant Covenanters from any recognition of the king's authority. It deemed their former moderate brethren to be on the king's side. So it was an extremely divisive document, but also one that cut the whole problem that they had with the covenants over what they meant. Were they supposed to acknowledge the king or not? Was he a tyrant or not? This was very clear. You can imagine the reaction, especially back in Edinburgh when they heard about this declaration. Stamp on the rats. A month later, Cameron was killed at Ayers Moss in Ayrshire. Among those captured on the battlefield was, yet again, John Malcolm. What Malcolm shows is that what happened in the Covenanters' prison profoundly radicalised both him and a wider Covenanter movement. The prisoners did not passively suffer. They chose to remain in the Covenanters' prison, defying both the king and moderate Presbyterian ministers. And when those ministers died in the crown, their stand in the prison was imbued with the crown of martyrdom. So in effect, the Covenanters' prison launched a brand new militant movement. It inspired a militant movement. And these events actually made people, some small groups of people, become more determined to resist the royalist regime. So Malcolm was among the first of this new movement, the so-called Cameronians, of its many martyrs. He was executed at Edinburgh on 13th August 1680, and he is probably buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Mark. Thank you ever so much. I just have such a richer appreciation of the role of the prison within the covenanting movement, and it's given me a really different kind of complexion to the kind of scale of people who were imprisoned and what their experience was. That was such a fantastic talk. Thank you so very much. Now we're going to stay with the kind of covenanting cause for our next paper, as I have the great pleasure of introducing all the way from Australia, Dr. Dolly McKinnon, Honorary Associate Professor at the University of Queensland, who's going to be talking on her paper, Halt Passengers, Take Heed on What Thou Dost See, the Scottish Covenanting Commemoration at Greyfriars and its echoes today. Thank you so very much.
Halt, passenger, take heed what thou dost see. Is a call to tarry a while and read and hear the message the Martyrs Monument has to tell about the Covenanters and Greyfriars. The Martyrs Memorial stands proud of the Kirkyard wall, visible from Candlemaker's Row below. It commemorates a series of Covenanter men who died well over 3.5 centuries ago. The inscription focuses on the martyred men, and as such, the inscription unintentionally obscures its broader and social cultural meaning and significance. If we reflect upon all those generations who stood before it, women and men of all ages, youth and children and infants, we then can appreciate the transgenerational audiences over the centuries that it has addressed. Over 10 generations have passed since the events that caused the need for a memorial to the Covenanters to be erected. With each generation has come the reworking of Covenanter memory and remembering, and when living memory died out in those initial generations, remembering has taken place. The multiple versions of the monument, because there were several erected, reflect the renewed focus and purpose of Covenanter history and memory as it extended into the preceding centuries. What I want to discuss here in terms of the Covenanters is that connection between family histories and collective histories. The Kirk and Kirkyard at Greyfriars is a heterotopic space, and by that I mean that multiple meanings coexist over time and simultaneously. It is both sacred and secular. It is both Roman Catholic and Presbyterian. The Covenanters were adherents and signatories of the National Covenant in 1638 that was signed in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Signed during the day and into the night, the signatories were lit by torchlight. These agreements, signed by congregations across Scotland, some signing in blood, supported the establishment of a Presbyterian church throughout England and Scotland that would do away with bishops and the episcopacy as a form of church government. While Scotland and England had adhered by 1650, their sense of spiritual triumph was to be fleeting, with the execution of Charles I in 1649 and then the remainder of the Cromwellian protectorates. The restoration of Charles II from 1660 onwards had seen the established church in Scotland lurch back to episcopacy, that is, to church government through the rule of bishops by statute in 1662. The Covenanters, also known as the Societies, were now branded nonconformist, who in turn were set on completing what they now saw as the incomplete reformation of the Church of Scotland. Their ongoing struggle was to reinstate the Presbyterian form of church government. The Covenanters found their loyalties challenged and their faith and religious worship tested. Driven out of their parish kirks, they worshipped in clandestine conventicles held in the open in all seasons and on the hills and moors from 1662 until the 1680s. First under Charles II and then James VII and II, Covenanters held an individual adherence to King Jesus rather than to the crown. They refused to take the oath of abjuration that required an individual to swear allegiance to the king as head of the church and his institution of an episcopal kirk within Scotland. They renounced both king and episcopal kirk in favour of their radical field preachers and their belief in the covenants that they had signed. The radical nature of their Covenanters' pursuit of a return to Covenanter Scotland is evident in the text of the oath of abjuration that they were required to sign renouncing this. I, and there inserted is the name, do hereby abhor, renounce and disown in the presence of Almighty God the pretended declarations of war lately affixed at several parish churches, insofar as it declares a war against His Majesty, His Sacred Majesty, and asserts that it is lawful to kill such as serve His Majesty in church, state, army and country. Covenanters would not take this oath, though some did, to avoid death and further persecution. Perplexed, John Livingston in 1671 claimed, "It is not now episcopacy and ceremonies that is the controversy in Scots religion, but rather the question was about whether Jesus Christ be king of his own church, or if the Leviathan of the supremacy shall swallow it all up." Covenanters were subjected to a wave of religious persecution, discrimination and banishment, each reinforced with a renewed vigour and viciousness and the practice of summary executions. The arrival of William of Orange did nothing to stem this violent discrimination. The Scottish Covenanters remained a revered, reviled and persecuted minority who in turn remained resolute in their endeavours as Christian soldiers to complete the unfinished business of a Calvinist reformation. For King Jesus to ultimately triumph in a global project for their religious freedom, the religious battleground of Scotland must first be won. Their actions were increasingly met by the state with punitive acts designed to subjugate and displace them, acts that required ultimate tariff, that of a human life. The Calvinist communities across Europe provided emotional support for those brethren, and indeed this image taken from Hind Let Loose is almost certainly produced by Calvinists in Holland. The punishments they incurred were corporeal acts of legal torture, branding, execution, and banishment to the plantations and colonies of Jamaica and Virginia and Barbados, should they survive the journey. It's important to remember that each side in this conflict considered themselves to be righteous. Both the Crown and the Covenanters believed theirs was the only true path to godly worship. What is more, either side believed that God sanctioned their actions, even when it moved into the realms of holy violence. In 1685, an act against preachers at conventicles and hearers at field conventicles proclaimed that our sovereign Lord, considering the obstinacy of the fanatical party who, notwithstanding all the laws formerly made against them, took further legal avenues to avenge their rebellious tide. For the Covenanters did persevere to keep their house and field conventicles, which are the nurseries and rendezvous of rebellion. Left with no option, therefore His Majesty, with the consent of his estates in Parliament, does statute and ordain this act, the emotional heart of which was that all as shall hereafter preach at such fanatical house or field conventicles, as well as all as such shall be present as hearers at field conventicles, shall be punished by death and confiscation of their goods. The emotional strategy in writing their version of histories used by the clandestine Covenanters was to construct their plight within the evocative framework of the martyrs of blood, a blood of martyrs, whereas Christian soldiers, they would continue the struggle for reformation and their religious freedoms, achieved first by word of mouth and then in print, and finally in tangible way through the erection and creation of inscriptions and memorials placed in the landscape. Their strategy was to harness the emotional role and function of exclusion, synonymous with the sacrifice and martyrdom experienced by King Jesus as a symbol of God's elect. Martyrdom was an emotional burden, but it was also a privilege, that was rewritten and recast by Covenanters simultaneously as the intolerable yoke of discrimination, but also that their struggle was inviolable. Evidence from the archives, material culture and landscape reveal the traces of displacement and burden that ultimately united this emotional community, and it can be seen in the family histories that survive for these groups. Traces from these events that occurred over 3 centuries ago, that is the equivalent of over 10 generations, have created competing transgenerational memories and echoes of the Covenanters. These monuments are still to be found throughout Scotland. Many of them have been replaced and renewed in the following centuries, and most of these monuments are in the remote and inaccessible places. These monuments are typified by a uniformity of inscription, a common form of monument containing a highly emotional language of their inscription used from the earliest monuments onwards, so from Greyfriars on. The symbol of the open-air meeting comprised the sword of a Christian soldier, the Bible of the Word of God, and the military banner of Covenanted Scotland. These were the symbols known to those gatherings of men, women, and children who worshipped regardless of the risk to their personal safety as transgenerational groups, a covenanted group, an emotional community. The memorial stone that was first erected at Greyfriars contained no inscription, simply a reference to the verse from the Bible, Revelations. It complemented other significant spaces and monuments associated with the Covenanters already in place at Greyfriars. The signing of the Covenant in 1638, the monument to Alexander Henderson, one of its instigators, which had seen its inscription defaced and removed and the monument shot at, and later by 1689 replaced and renewed. It was also a place where the Covenanters had been brought after the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, and the prisoners had been held here in other spaces as well. And it was also the burial place of some of the martyrs, such as Argyll and Renwick, allegedly. It was therefore a Covenanter or Protestant religious site, but it was also a Roman Catholic Greyfriars place. The names of those who petitioned to have a monument erected here, that monument with only the reference to the Revelations verse, the petition was submitted to the council in Edinburgh in 1706. And what they wanted was a monument to be erected near the place of interment of those persons who suffered in the late times and were buried in Greyfriars Kirk. The charge of this was to be paid by private hands. They also craved that the council would allow the said monument to be put up without paying anything to the Kirk treasurer, as was done in Glasgow and other places of the nation, there being no inscription to be put on the tomb, but simply chapter 6 of Revelations, verse 6, 9, 10, and 11. While the monument would have no inscription, the power of Revelations, I think, is worthy of stating. If I read just verse 10, "And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on earth?" The monument then did have an inscription, and let me now just read you the inscription that's here. You can see in the monument that's now held at the Museum of Edinburgh. "Halt, passengers, take heed what thou dost see. This tomb does show what men did lie. Here lie interred ye dust of those who stood 'gainst perjury, resisting unto blood, adhering to the covenant and laws, establishing the same which was the cause. Their lives were sacrificed unto the lust of prelates adjured, though here they are dust, lie mixed with murderers and other crew, whom justice did justify to death pursue. But as for these, there's no cause was found, worthy of death, but only they were sound, constant, steadfast, zealous, and witnessing for the prerogatives of Christ their King, which truth was sealed by famous Guthrie's head, and all along to Master Renwick's blood, that it endure the wrath of enemies, reproaches, torments, death and injuries, but yet there these who from such troubles come, and now triumph in glory with the Lamb. From May 27, 1661, that the noble Marquess of Argyll suffered, to the 17th of February 1688, that Master James Renwick suffered, were executed at Edinburgh about 100 of noblemen, gentlemen, ministers, and other noble martyrs for Jesus Christ, the most part of them lying here. This tomb was erected in 1706. The preservation of this stone with its inscription was due entirely to a monument that was erected in the 1770s, creating a bill that was unpaid. The monument was retained in a family and passed through a series of hands in the family before it was then handed over to the Huntley House in Edinburgh in the early part of the 20th century. The reconstruction of the monument and elaboration of the monument then points to the renewed vigour with which Covenanter memory existed into the 18th and 19th centuries as political events used their memory to pursue their fights for freedom. This monument was part of a collective effort to commemorate Scotland and the Covenanters. The conclusion of the meeting at Crawford John in 1701 had required all the correspondents there to provide and make ready stones as signs of honour to be set upon the graves of the martyrs as soon as possible. What is more, communities were tasked with writing down the names of the martyrs and their speeches and testimonies by whom they were martyred and killed in houses or fields, countries or cities as far as possible, and that information was to be brought to the next general meeting. The epitaphs and likewise were then to be ratified by the gathering, so you have collective memory and collective history being purposely created and then spread about across the countryside. When the Martyrs Monument was renewed in the 17th century, the old monument was taken down, and as a result of an unpaid bill, it was kept in safekeeping, again in family hands. So what we have is collective memory, and the memory of these elements also contained within family memories. So there are things like the Binks Cup here at Greyfriars, which was a communion cup for field communions, and again, it was passed down through family hands. Now, this monument was also connected with James Curry and Helen Alexander. They had been married by James Renwick, and this is their monument, now in keeping at the Museum of Edinburgh, along with the first copy of the Covenant, which apparently was the one that was signed here at Greyfriars Kirkyard. So what we have also is that Helen Alexander had looked after the body and prepared the body for burial of James Renwick. So again, the connections of the families in the construction of these histories over time. Helen Alexander's own spiritual reflections were published in the 19th century by descendants of her children. So with each renewal, the Covenanter story shifts and is told for different and new political purposes. Here's the monument that I saw in 2018, and I visited it in the February, and you can see that flowers have been placed at the bottom of the monument. You can see it's in dire straits with parts of the stone peeling off, and the inscription has changed yet again in the late 18th, early 19th century. Now, what is also important to realise is that with the creation of photography and also stereoscopes, which came about as a result of the Great Exhibition in 1851, these images of the Martyrs Monument were available to people around the globe. And what you could do is actually stand and view the stereoscope as if you were standing there yourself. What's more is that the plight of the monument over time was also reported in the press globally. For example, in 1898, in an article about the loss of heritage in Edinburgh and the loss of its history, it was reported in the Australian press that the famous Martyrs Monument was dismantled and lying upon the grass, as repairs were made to the external wall of the kirkyard. And of course, there was concern and consternation that in fact that this monument would be re-erected because it was an important part of Edinburgh's history and must be retained. So here, what I've tried to show you over the past is an intersection between family histories, collective histories, and the uses of histories over time, particularly for the Covenanters and Greyfriars. In conclusion then, the ongoing renovation of the Covenanter Monument represents an intentional and continuing linking of the past to the present. Yet there are inherent tensions between history, landscape and tourism and the present. What we have considered is just a part of this heterotopic story of Greyfriars Kirkyard. The landscape of Greyfriars is already richly inscribed with meaning as a place and space and with spirituality. These reflect individual, family and community groups. Dark tourism sees the Mortlock graves to prevent grave robbing as sites of tourism. The Martyrs Monument and Covenanters bring people interested in the spiritual history of Scotland's past. And the family monument of Tom Riddle now brings the character of Harry Potter from Harry Potter novels into the realm of Greyfriars. So the Covenanters monument from the 17th century onwards remains dynamic with its changing form, its changing inscriptions and its changing uses over time. The past is continually rewritten and recast, not just for our present, but also for our future. And one wonders what the Covenanters would say about the way their histories are now being used.
Wow, thank you so much. That was just the most amazing talk. It took us through the kind of complexities of how we look at our history in the past. It took us back to the kind of complexities of the mindset of the people who lived that history. And I'm really delighted to be able to tell everybody today that the Covenanters Monument has also recently been repaired at the hands of the City of Edinburgh Council as well. So this monument is going to have an ongoing history and relevance for our society today and in the future as well. So I'm really pleased now to be able to introduce our next speaker to you, which is Professor Stuart J. Brown, who is from the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. And he's going to be taking us to more recent times in the church's history as he talks about Greyfriars and the progressive Presbyterian vision from around 1760 to 1910, the ministries of William Robertson, Robert Lee and John Glass. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you, Susan. Well, as we've been hearing in the fascinating talks by Mark and Dolly, the Greyfriars Church and Churchyard are best known for their associations with the National Covenant of 1638 and the Covenanting movements, which were so important in shaping Scottish national identity. In my talk, we'll move forward in time and consider how Greyfriars Church, and I'll be discussing the church rather than the churchyard, continued to play a vital Scottish national role from the late 18th to the early 20th centuries, shaping civic society, enriching worship, and promoting progressive social views. And I'll be discussing three extraordinary ministers of Greyfriars Church. The first of these is William Robertson, who was minister of Old Greyfriars for some 32 years, from 1761 to his death in 1793. Now, Robertson can be described as the presiding genius of the Scottish Enlightenment. He was one of Europe's leading historians who in reputation stood alongside Gibbon, Voltaire, and David Hume. His celebrated works included a history of early modern Scotland, a history of 16th century Europe, a history of the Spanish conquest and settlement of the Americas, and a history of India. He was principal of the University of Edinburgh from 1762 to 1793, presiding over the transformation of the university from a modest town college to one of the leading universities in the world, with special strengths in medicine and moral philosophy. Robertson was the acknowledged leader of the Church of Scotland from the 1750s to about 1780, managing business in the Presbyterian church courts, promoting the ideal of a learned clergy actively working for social improvement, while moving Scotland's national church towards greater tolerance. He was the principal founder of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scotland's National Academy for the Arts and Sciences. Robertson's father had been a previous minister of Old Greyfriars from 1736 until his death in 1745. Before his own appointment as minister of Greyfriars, the younger Robertson had served as a Church of Scotland parish minister for some 15 years. And despite his work, the work of the university principalship and his historical scholarship, Robertson took his responsibilities to Greyfriars Church seriously. He preached regularly, presided over parish administration. Although he was a master of English prose, he chose to preach in a broad, natural Scots, giving a sense of immediacy to his sermons. He preached from memory rather than a prepared text, and he published only one sermon, but we have notes of a number of his Greyfriars sermons. His emphasis was on practical morality and social duties. He was a broadly orthodox Calvinist committed to the Westminster Confession of Faith, but he also believed that God had created human beings with an innate moral sense and that this could be developed through reason. What God requires of man, he noted in a sermon in 1788, is a reasonable service. He taught that individuals could cultivate habits of moral behavior that would elevate character. These formed what he termed habits for eternity. He combined this with a strong sense of providence and a belief that under God there was gradual improvement in the world. He took an active interest in the care of the poor, promoting increased local taxation to support poor relief. He was a leading supporter of Roman Catholic relief, seeking to end the civil disabilities under which Catholics suffered. His prominent advocacy of a Catholic relief bill in 1779 led to an anti-Catholic mob attack on his home. Robertson and his family had to be taken to Edinburgh Castle for their safety. His historical writings included condemnations of slavery and imperialist exploitation. In a sermon delivered to mark the centenary of the Revolution of 1688, he envisaged the future advance of civil liberties across Europe. So during his long Greyfriars ministry, Robertson promoted notions of Presbyterian civic society, uniting church, university, and the legal establishment, committed to a progressive improvement so that all might flourish. Well, moving forward 50 years after Robertson's death to 1843, and we find that Scotland had become a very different place from what Robertson had envisaged. There was more religious division and strife. Large numbers of Scots had left the established church, and many now angrily demanded the end of that church. In 1843, the Church of Scotland was broken up by the Great Disruption, with nearly half the membership leaving to form the Free Church amid a bitter conflict over the nature of the church-state connection. By 1843, perhaps only a third of Scotland's population now adhered to the established national church. The city of Edinburgh, moreover, was suffering serious social deprivation associated with industrialization and rapid urban growth. The Robertsonian ideal of a Presbyterian civic society was breaking up. In 1843, Robert Lee was appointed minister of Old Greyfriars to fill a vacancy resulting from the disruption. Now, Lee came from an artisan background. He was nearly 40 years of age, and he was intellectually gifted. In 1847, he was appointed professor of biblical criticism at the University of Edinburgh, combining that with his ministry at Greyfriars. Lee was convinced that the National Church of Scotland must regain its national influence. It must revive the Robertsonian ideal of a civic society and seek to improve social conditions, especially for the working classes. And to do this, it needed to attract people back into its congregations, especially members of the educated classes. Lee became convinced that people were leaving the established church in part due to its drab forms of worship, with a droning of psalms and extemporary prayers that could ramble on for 20 to 40 minutes and were often ill-digested repetitions of tired phrases and theological jargon. No, Lee was attracted instead to the liturgical reforms, the reforms in worship associated with the Oxford movement in England and with Romanticism. The church, he insisted, had to be progressive. It had to embrace changes in cultural tastes. It should be said he also advocated Sunday openings of museums, art galleries, and parks so that working people could enjoy them. In January 1845, Greyfriars Church was gutted by a devastating fire. When it was rebuilt and reopened in 1857, Lee sought to place the reopened Greyfriars Church at the forefront of a reform movement in religious worship. The rebuilt church had stained glass windows, the first stained glass installed in a Scottish Presbyterian church since the Reformation. Lee prepared a printed order of service with set prayers and congregational responses. Each service opened with a solemn call to worship and closed with a benediction. Lee enhanced the role of music in his services with a trained choir to lead congregational singing. And then in 1864, he introduced an organ into the church. Again, the first organ since the Reformation. He reversed a long-standing convention and had the congregation stand for singing and sit for prayer. And these innovations, intended to bring more beauty and decorum to worship, were welcomed by most of the Greyfriars congregation. However, they aroused a storm of controversy within the Church of Scotland as a whole, with conservative Presbyterians condemning Lee's popish innovations in the church courts, and the General Assembly acting to suppress the innovations. Matters were not helped by Lee's highly strung, confrontational personality. Lee was to have been disciplined and very possibly deposed from the ministry of the Church of Scotland by the General Assembly of 1867 for his innovations. But then, just a few days before the assembly, he suffered a debilitating stroke, and he died several months later in 1868. By now, though, other Church of Scotland ministers, mainly young liberals who shared Lee's concern to revive the Church's national influence, had embraced the cause of liturgical reform. In 1865, they founded the Church Service Society to enhance worship through the study and use of ancient and modern liturgies. It steadily gained support, and by 1900, about a third of Church of Scotland ministers were members. The Society's library is still kept at Greyfriars. There was a rapid spread of organs, trained choirs, and stained glass in Presbyterian churches across Scotland. It all contributed, as Lee had hoped, to a significant revival of the National Church of Scotland. John Glass and Christian Socialism. In 1877, a decade after Lee's stroke, another extraordinary man, John Glass, was ordained to the ministry of Greyfriars. He came from a rural background. He was not yet 30, and his Greyfriars ministry would continue for 32 years until his retirement in 1909. From the beginning of his ministry, Glass was distressed over the poverty in the district, especially the Cowgate and the Grass Market. And during the 1880s, he was drawn into the socialist movement, largely through student societies at the university. And he became distinctive among the Scottish Presbyterian clergy as one of only a few, at this time, avowed socialists. He became a popular socialist lecturer and author. He was active in a number of socialist societies. He gathered around himself many, quote, ardent idealists, and he made his manse at Tantallon Place a socialist meeting place in Edinburgh. His friends included the Scottish miners' leader, Keir Hardie, the socialist and secularist feminist Annie Besant, and the socialist artist William Morris. And he hosted many visiting socialist speakers in Edinburgh. His memberships included the Land and Labour League, the Socialist League, and the Christian Socialist Society. In the early 1890s, he founded the Glasgow branch of the Independent Labour Party, along with the Scottish socialist artist J. Bruce Glacier. In 1892, Glass became the first president of the newly formed Edinburgh branch of the Fabian Society, which aimed at the gradual achievement of a socialist commonwealth through democratic politics rather than violent revolution. Glass published several books and pamphlets based on his public lectures. He was an evolutionary, essentially ethical socialist. He found his socialist ideas rooted more in Christianity and the Scottish past than in Marxist doctrine. In 1899, Glass caused a stir when he was invited to speak on Christianity and socialism at the first annual Church Congress of the Church of Scotland, where he argued that the ethics of Christianity and of socialism were, quote, obviously the same. In The Relation of the Church to Socialism, published in 1900, he called on church members in the, quote, spirit of the prophets and of Jesus to work with socialists in breaking every yoke and letting the oppressed go free. In a book on John Knox, published in 1905, Glass portrayed the Scottish reformer as an early social democrat, seeking to elevate the common people and to make, quote, kings and priests of all people within a godly commonwealth. So Glass worked to revive the Robertsonian idea of a Christian civic society but now in an urban industrial society and uniting church and social democracy. Well, I must close. The three Greyfriars ministers, William Robertson, Robert Lee, and John Glass, were, in their different ways, extraordinary public figures, representing the Christian communal tradition of this historic city center church. And with the support of their respective Greyfriars congregations, and this congregational support is important to note. These figures ensured that Greyfriars, the Church of the National Covenant, represented progressive social ideals and continued to play a vital role in Scotland's national development. Thank you.
Professor Brown, that was a fantastic paper, and it was a really great companion paper too, in terms of showing how individuals can have such an effect on movements. And previously we were looking at the kind of covenanting cause, so it was brilliant to be able to see just how much individuals can shape these kind of larger kind of movements. So I'm just unilaterally deciding that we will have a very quick questions and answers session now. So we will come back slightly later after tea break. So if I could invite Professor Brown, Dr. Jardine, Dr. McKinnon to come, and I'll just kind of pose some questions now that we've had from the floor. So Eileen has mentioned that she has some family members who she knows were Covenanters, and she wondered whether Mark could tell her which sources she might go and have a look at in order to find out a little bit more about them.
About her relatives?
Yes, that's right, yes. She's going to do genealogical research.
Yes. I guess it depends which time period of the covenant we're talking about. Obviously, you would start with something maybe like King Hewson's The Covenanters in 2 volumes, which is a very accessible book in terms of just being able to get into the whole thing. Or Standing Witnesses, if it's about the later Covenanters. There's a book called Standing Witnesses by Thorbjorn Campbell, which deals with all the monuments and graves to them. And that's also very useful because it has a lot of information about the individuals who are in there. I'm trying to think what else. I mean, where would you go? You could try my website, Jardin's Book of Martyrs. I'm going to plug my own website shamelessly. Because I have about 1,000 people on that website in my sort of databases. But that's about the Covenanters in the 1680s, effectively. So it depends, it depends which the Covenanter was when they lived. I mean, if it was in the 1640s, then it's a different set of records than the one that I would use.
Brilliant. But the place to start then, Mark, is your website. And having said, I've looked at it myself. It's a fantastic resource. So I completely advise people to go and have a look. Could you possibly put a link to the website in the chat for us so that everybody can go off and have a quick peek during their tea break? So Dolly, I have a question for you, if I may, which is from Claire, who would love to know more about the symbol on the Martyrs Monument of a pick and shovel. Was that the symbol of the movement?
Now that's a good one. I don't know. I can't answer that, but maybe Mark could answer that. You got any wise thoughts there, Mark?
No.
There we are.
It's unusual because it post-dates all the martyrs' graves, which were erected, as far as I can tell, between 1702 and 1714, probably. Though some maybe as late as the 1720s. and they tend not to have symbols on them. So I'm slightly mystified by the pick and the shovel, because they tend to be very textual. I mean, the early monuments are very textual, and they're all like condemning. They're sort of like radical poetry in stone, and so they're for people to read and to invite them to sort of see the sufferings, and there's sort of a tremendous sort of ability to condemn people for having betrayed these people, which is quite radical thing to put in stone about members of the elite in a churchyard or in a field or anywhere. And in some senses, all those monuments out in the fields are actually, giving graves to people who had been refused a decent burial in a churchyard. And so they were sort of bringing them into the whole kind of the congregation or the community and marking these people as being honourable by putting graves up to them. But why the pick and the shovel would be on that, I don't know, is my answer. I have no idea, because it is a very different form to the martyrs' graves.
But perhaps they were just mortality symbols. Then they were kind of standing for the grave diggers' tools when they were digging the grave. Maybe that was their meaning.
I think what this also tells you is that there's a lot more to be done on this. For all of the history that's been written about the Covenanters, and there's been a lot, I think there is just this kind of detail around the material culture of it, not just the text, but also the elements that are in there. And I think that, constantly going back and revisiting history, I think is worth a shot, because, probably an interdisciplinary team would have a better shot at answering.
Absolutely. Well, we've just had a comment from Morag, who suggested that the pick and shovel shows they have been given a Christian burial. Maybe that was the message that was being conveyed. So I have one final question before we all break for tea, which is for Professor Brown. And this is my question. So I'm just using the kind of chair's privilege to ask a question. So I'm really interested to know whether the ministers that you talk about, whether they often preached within the churchyards to any of the congregations. So, for example, during the fire, was the churchyard used then for services? And whether there are any other ways that we can point to in terms of how the ministers influenced how people felt about the churchyard, or about the kind of sense of place of Greyfriars as a whole?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not aware that any of the ministers that I was discussing preached in the churchyard as opposed to the pulpit. When the church was gutted, and it took a long time for it to be rebuilt, partly because of the religious strife at the time, the city council wouldn't approve the funds to rebuild it. The congregation had moved to what was then called the Victoria Hall, which later became known as the Toll Booth Church, and is now the hub. So they worship there. I think that all three of the ministers, though, were very much aware of the sense of the covenanting past as representing a communal past, a communal ideal, and they all, in their different ways, were trying to preserve that communal ideal. So I'm sure that the martyrs around the churchyard would have been a continual inspiration for their sermons and their church ideal.
That's wonderful. Thank you ever so much for that answer. And I have to say, we've had a fantastic opening session, haven't we, to this conference? I'm just so blown away by all of these papers. They have just fitted together so brilliantly, and I think they've all left us with a much stronger sense of the importance of the church history for us to understand and appreciate Greyfriars Kirkyard today. So what we're going to do is we're going to break now for tea break, and we're going to reconvene at 11:30 when we will introduce our second session, which is all about the tourists. Thank you so much.